Call the Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, July 16th, 2024 to order. Mr. Klecker will not be here. Richard Spiker is here. I'm here. Tony Masanowski is not. Colin?
Present.
Jason?
Present.
We have a quorum. We can proceed. Approval of June 18th meeting minutes as distributed. Has everybody looked at them?
Yep. I will move to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Zoning ordinance amendments. Jake, do you want to talk about the current revisions, updates?
Thank you. So we have a couple of relatively minor revisions to the amendments that were proposed and recommended for adoption last month. What I distributed does have the entire list of amendments that have been recommended for adoption so far, and but I will go through the additions to the recommendations. These were a couple of relatively miscellaneous but related add-ons as I went through the remainder of the ordinance, a couple of sections that were some modest language that was also affected by the recommendations we made last month. On page 2, this is all related to, for the most part, related to the discussions we've been having about group homes and group care arrangements. Under N on the permitted uses in residential districts, so top half of page 2, under N, we had removed, since we're recommending daycare centers be changed from a special exception to permitted use, that part of the sentence that says as a special exception be deleted. And then O is again a special exception statement that was in the ordinance, that now that the group home is going to be listed as a permitted use, that special exception verbiage needs to be removed from the ordinance. So section 305.1, that entire section would be removed since it would be no longer applicable. Moving over to page 3, under group home, it's a relatively modest language modification. There were some questions brought up last month regarding provided by, the statement of that service is provided by a governmental agency, their licensed certified agents, or other responsible nonprofit social service corporation. It was pointed out that the lack of a comma between their licensed certified agents, comma, or other there was a lack of a comma there. And so there was a potential that could be interpreted that it still would have to be a corporation affiliated with a government agency or their agents. So we literally are adding a comma there to remove that discrepancy and that potential misinterpretation or alternate interpretation, if you will. Also, the top half is slightly modified. I found what I believe is more appropriate description of the group home whereby we're referring to it as a living arrangement, where the disabled resident occupants live together as a common household and receive regular support services from 2 or more staff persons on a 24-hour-a-day basis. It's important that we use that term, that the occupants live together as a common household, since that is consistent with the language above regarding our definitions of family, that use that same verbiage of maintaining a common household. It helps to support what we discussed, which is that a group home is a residential single-family dwelling setting. So those two terms and definitions are more consistent with that amendment. And related to that, we had discussed the group care facility and group residence facility, and that they were very similar in nature, and we were recommending that the group residence facility term and definition be deleted. However, there was a statement in that group residence facility that I believe needed to also be in that group care facility. So that's what you see at the end is the addition of the statement that says this does not include facilities for the care or treatment of persons released from or under the jurisdiction of a government bureau of corrections or similar institution, and in parentheses says see custodial care facility, which we do have listed as a separate use that is also defined, and that is for court-ordered placement type facilities. What comes to mind would be a facility like the Edmund L. Thomas Adolescent Center, even though that's not located in the city of Erie. But it's a court-ordered placement. There's a couple of other scenarios that would fit under custodial care versus group care facilities, so I think it's important to make that distinction.
Where does somebody like a Mercy Center for Women fit into those other agencies out there that aren't government? They're not providing care. It's more transitional housing.
Right, and that was the importance of adding that comma that distinguishes other responsible nonprofit social service corporations as a separate entity that can provide those services. And you could assume as a group home, because we did have that comma under both definitions for group home and group care facility. So it does then clarify that these other nonprofits can operate a group home or a group care facility. So
it's
like
more
the
in line
Mercy
with
Center.
Group residence facility definition, though. Just using Mercy Center as an example.
Right, and if it's a single-family dwelling, and the Mercy Center operates that, and the persons occupying that dwelling are considered disabled, then it would be considered a group home.
But what if there's multiple units?
Then I think it fits more under a group care facility if there are specialized services that are being provided to them. However, the Mercy Center, when they converted the school, is it Holy Rosary? Right?
Yes. Yeah.
When they converted that, they got several use variances permitted, one of which was just apartments, essentially, multiple family dwellings. So there was no disability kind of thing. It's just they're providing housing for this particular demographic. It's not really related to providing services to any disabled individuals.
I guess my point is there's no care, so it's not group care facility in that case.
Yeah, but
But it would be a single-family dwelling under group home, which it's not. So where would they fall into?
I guess, yeah, I think in line with that, it almost seems like the wording maybe should be reconsidered to not necessarily specify that it is, physical or mental handicap services being provided, but specialized services of some type. I think that provides some degree of flexibility in terms of how that's interpreted, so it could accommodate
Yeah, but,
something like what you're describing, but
but the last item in the list of possibilities, comma, or housing services, which, as I would understand it, is what they provide.
Right.
You know, you don't have to check every box to the last one. I think there's a bunch of optional,
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I did put a comma there also,
yes.
comma, or housing, so that rehabilitative or housing were then
Transitional housing,
distinguished
yeah,
as
that-
separate
Yeah.
okay.
services
Yeah.
too.
Yep.
Yeah, the comma thing was just brought up.
the power of a
Within the
little
last
ink.
couple of weeks. And so we, it seemed like that was a reasonable interpretation. So we was like, well, let's make sure we get these commas in there because that broadens the scope of these definitions.
But in that
Well,
one,
it helps
so-
to specify them too.
Sorry, where we say housing services provided by, then it continues with governmental agency, though. Or am I
Well,
missing?
yeah, no, you're right.
But so
Provided
in
by
that
a
ca-
governmental agency, they're licensed or certified agents or
Responsible
responsible, or other
nonprofit, yeah.
responsible nonprofit social service corporation,
So it covers every potential provider.
other than a for-profit
Right.
entity providing those services.
Right. And I guess the important thing is to not forget that, our current definition of family that talks about permanent group homes are different from transitional housing.
Mhm.
And that's why the definition of group home really does need to be in line with that permanent group home statement in the definition of family. Because that is much different from providing transitional housing, which is essentially what the Mercy Center provides. It's transitional housing. It's not a permanent living arrangement for disabled folks. So that's why there is that distinguishment about disabled persons in a permanent group home living arrangement. I mean, I don't think we're not covered by those other agencies that provide housing services that are more transitional in nature. I think we're also covered in that regard. And I guess the other arrangement that does come up, and this really does kind of go back to when we were talking about group housing in general, is the rooming house definition, which also provides for unrelated residents, to be living together. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a good segue into the rooming boarding home. That there's an amendment to that definition as well, just to help to clarify that. The other definition had a lot of superfluous language in it that wasn't really necessary. So the definition has been simplified, just to indicate that it's any dwelling or part of a dwelling containing one or more rooming units, which space is let by the owner or operator to 5 or more unrelated persons. So, and that does go back to, you have to tie these statements together into what other uses are listed and defined in the zoning ordinance, like dwelling unit or family. They all have to be in line with each other. So that's a per dwelling unit type scenario.
Is this an opportunity to backdoor a hotel into rooming and boarding without that exclusion?
No, because we do have hotel motel listed as a separate and defined use. So if that's the determination that that the operation is a hotel and not a rooming house. I mean, the distinguishment is that it's actually a dwelling unit versus, and a hotel is not. Because it's
Yeah.
listed as a transient, hotels are listed as a transient use.
What about extended stay, gray area?
Yeah, under definitions, the term dwelling or the word dwelling shall not include hotels, motels, short-term rentals, or other structures used for transient residence. So I don't think there's any way to misinterpret the hotel motel from dwelling where, because rooming houses can be sometimes permanent and sometimes transient. The occupants can be sometimes long-term occupants and sometimes not. And I think that what we want to make sure that we're addressing is the number of occupants in that dwelling unit and not necessarily whether they're permanent or transient. Just the number of folks that are occupying that building at any one time.
Do we define rooming units anywhere?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that rooming unit is defined. Dwelling unit certainly is. If that's the case, we can do two things. We can either remove that term rooming unit and just use the term rooms, or add a definition for a rooming unit.
What is a distinguishing characteristics of rooming units mean? Do they have separate bathrooms, cooking facilities?
And that's more like a hotel.
I understand that, but
Right.
If we can't define it, we can't really measure it very well. If we can't define it, we can't
Yeah.
measure it.
right. That's
And the most appropriate thing to do would be to either eliminate the term rooming unit and just use rooms. Because I know there are different scenarios. I know that there are some scenarios where most of the rooming houses that I'm familiar with in the city are just rooms. They do not have separate bathroom facilities per room. The rooms are essentially locked off by the occupant, and the rest of the house is used as a common household. They have common living space, common bathrooms, common kitchen. So it kind of goes back to that occupancy issue of if it's 4 or less related folks, you're just a regular single-family dwelling, even if you're locking your room at night or when you're not there. But if it's 5 or more folks, you're still sharing a common household in this rooming house scenario, which is why it's that statement that it's part of a dwelling. It's a dwelling or part of a dwelling, and not a hotel or a motel.
You could call it the Starlight Hotel.
Right, which I think actually had a license. I think they had a hotel license.
They did.
But they might have been
But they were
sharing.
this, though,
They
weren't they?
may have technically, even though they called themselves a hotel, I think technically they were still considered a rooming house.
But we don't want that in those, I guess is what, they're the example I would, what zones do we allow these in?
Rooming houses?
Yeah.
I think they're permitted in R3 and RLB.
Do we want Starlight hotels in those zones?
Well, I mean, there's certainly strict standards. They're registered, licensed, and inspected annually.
Yeah.
Typically a place like that, obviously, let's see, rooming, yeah, residential limited business is right now, it's a permitted use in that district.
I think that was R2 where it was.
And I believe the recommendation was to have them listed as permitted in R3. They are a special exception right now.
Can we make them special exceptions everywhere?
Yeah, that was the recommendation. I mean, because there are conditions listed in the ordinance. Let me look at that. For rooming houses. 30510. So let's take a look at that real quick, just so you know what we're talking about. I think that was 30510. Okay. So in R3, right now, there is, in 30510, that does have a statement about it as a special exception use in R3, which says that no more than 6 boarders may be housed, and that each boarder has an off-street, on-site parking space, and that the owner or leaser of the residence shall reside full-time on the premises. That's pretty restrictive, all the way around. And I guess if we change that from special exception to permitted, then 30510 goes away, right? I mean, and I was trying to list some of those other references to special exceptions in the proposed amendments. I suppose that, if we're in agreement that the rooming house would be permitted in R3, then we would want to remove that section as well about the special exception conditions in R3.
I guess in general, I'm fine getting rid of special exceptions.
I like it as a principle. I like getting rid of them as a principle.
Yeah. Zoning code ought to tell you people what they can do and not run them through a mill of other requirements that they need to go comply with. Can I suggest that instead of rooming units, we simply say the sleeping rooms without separate facilities, sharing common use, something like that?
Yeah.
That,
So you don't have to define it.
yeah,
I'm good with that.
separate bathing facility, that, separate facilities, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's appropriate to try and tighten that up. And that, I mean, the existing definition was certainly not really very descriptive.
Right.
And this gets closer to that. So we probably want to use that sharing a common household.
Yeah, without
Language.
separate facilities, which precludes the
Having
separate
5 bathrooms.
bathrooms or
Right.
individual bathrooms and cooking facilities. Yeah, and otherwise sharing common living facilities.
As far as 30510, and I'm kind of mulling that over. I mean, I think we can draft this language today. So we want to remove the term rooming units.
Yep.
Any dwelling or part of a dwelling containing one or more rooms. Do we just want to remove the statement containing one or more rooming units and say any dwelling or part of a dwelling in which space is let to operate 5 or more unrelated, in which rooms are let?
I mean, part of me is inclined to say, take it out, and then if we find that there are issues, we can tighten it. I'm hesitant to try and get so specific with that definition that we twist ourselves into knots when it may or may not even be a practical issue. I mean, it's something we can easily add language to based on things that occur, in my mind.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes in any ordinance, every term is not always specifically defined.
Right.
And you use common definitions, I mean, that's the charges. You go to the dictionary, use common definitions. So, so you're right. I mean, it's sometimes, the language can be very specific, but not necessarily have to be specifically defined, and can still be interpreted to cover pretty much every scenario that comes in. With maybe few exceptions.
I guess I would be okay if we just say one or more rooms, comma, in which space the whole facility is let by the owner, as opposed to trying to nail the gnat with a hammer.
I guess when you look at it that way, saying space is let, because you're kind of renting the whole house. You have your own room to yourself, but you're using the entire house.
Yeah.
You're using the common living area.
Yeah, shared
Yeah.
space.
My only trepidation is that we're one stop on the train that gets this done, and is council going to want to come back and deal with a little slice of something? I mean, that's a decision.
Yeah, I mean, I
can see either
think
way.
dwelling, certainly the definition of dwelling covers that it's a common household. So, I mean, I think that really kind of sets the type of building that it is.
And I would agree that the hotel and apartment definitions seem to exclude this as being a backdoor way to get into it.
Right.
Get into a facility like that.
Let me look at that real quick. Hotel motel, building containing sleeping rooms principally for the use of transient and sometimes containing accessory uses such as kitchen and dining facilities, lounge, meeting rooms, convention facilities, and other commercial uses permitted within the use district. So it's, I mean, that's part of any proposed use, that any proposed development that comes in the door and they said, well, this is what I want to provide, this is what I want to do. And, you know, the ordinance is going to say, well, that falls under the definition of a hotel motel, or that falls under a definition of a rooming house. And I think that the big distinction is that a rooming house has to be a dwelling unit. That's the big distinction. It basically says this is a residential structure, residential building. It's a dwelling unit. That's the distinguishment between hotel, motel, and rooming house. Now, to follow up with 305.10, you know, that has those restrictions for R3, we can still impose, if we want to say, well, you know, RLB, that's good for rooming houses to, you know, maybe a larger rooming house in an RLB district. If we want to limit the size of rooming houses in R3, it's a high-density residential zoning district. But, you know, we could still utilize that 305.10, remove the term as a special exception, but we still could, I don't know that, you know, we could modify 305.10 to be more suited. If you feel like there should be restrictions to rooming houses in R3, that's what that would be used, that's what that 305.10 would be used for, to set conditions for the rooming houses. So that we can set conditions, operational conditions. In that case, I mean, yeah, unfortunately, I don't have that included in the attachment, but, you know, just to reread it, you know, that rooming and boarding houses shall be allowed as a special exception in the R3 district if they meet the following conditions: no more than 6 boarders, each boarder has to have an off-street parking space, and the owner or leaser of the residence shall reside full-time on the premises. I don't think there's any rooming house that would meet any of those qualifications anywhere. Because none of the owners or operators of these rooming houses live on site that I'm aware of. They're all rental properties. And some of them do have off-street parking. Not all, but some do have off-street parking. It probably does not match the number of boarders, but some do have their own off-street parking. And most of the time, as far as the number of boarders, that is most of the time dictated by the building itself, by the structure itself. That's going to limit the number of occupants due to the building code requirements. So you have to have a certain size bedroom to have an occupant in it, right? 70 square feet, I believe, is the minimum. 120 square feet is the minimum bedroom size for a 2-person bedroom. These are all building code requirements that, you know, the zoning ordinance defers to things like that as far as occupancy goes. The short-term rental program is the same thing. Even though the zoning ordinance says a short-term rental is limited to one family because it's a single-family dwelling, the number of actual occupants can vary based on the size of the building, the number of bedrooms, size of the bedrooms, even though it's one family. A building might be able to accommodate a 10-person family. Another building might only be able to accommodate a 4-person family. So I think it's worth looking at whether or not we want to keep any of those restrictions or modify them or delete that in its entirety.
Take the axe to it.
So do we have,
Sometimes it's easier just
yeah,
physically see. Yeah, this is how it reads. It's 305.10. Right here.
are there any current rooming houses in the city?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Any in an R3 that would?
My guess is yes, that there are probably a couple in R3 that I would need to verify that.
Okay,
Because generally, they've been permitted in RLB.
right.
And we've had a couple people that have actually gotten variances to operate a rooming house in an R2 district. One case that I'm thinking of was that the property was immediately adjacent to an RLB district. It was right on the line. And they were actually considering, they wanted to see if they would qualify as a group home.
Right.
But they were not a bona fide nonprofit entity to provide these housing services. So the default is, if you want to have more than, if you want to have this large number of unrelated folks, then you are classified as a rooming house.
Right.
So they did get approval to operate as a rooming house. And they may pursue the nonprofit status and, that kind of thing later on, but they do have approval for the number of occupants that are living there now. And it's a transient kind of three-quarter house type situation.
Kill it.
Kill it?
Take the axe to it.
Yeah, I think, I would agree with, support removing the restrictions entirely. The requirement for special exception or the uses underneath, or the restrictions underneath, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I certainly think that two of the three requirements, based on, requiring off-street parking for every occupant, that kind of goes against what we've been
Yeah,
discussing as far as trying to reduce those kinds of barriers to housing options. And even the ownership or, the presence of the owner and that kind of thing. Again, that's just kind of imposing another barrier to that type of housing option. So, I think, it would fall in line with what the Planning Commission has been promoting, which is kind of eliminating these barriers to these different types of housing options. And, even the, limit or putting a maximum on the number of boarders. That is, I think those things will be addressed, occupancy will be addressed as part of the building code compliance. You will not have a building approved for a larger number of occupants than the building can handle. They will not get an occupancy permit from our building inspector for that. And that is part of our inspection program right now. They are issued an occupancy permit that actually limits the number of occupants. That's the zoning certificates I have on file for the rooming houses actually states the maximum number of occupants.
okay.
So it sounds like we would add that removal of 305.10 for the rooming house special exception.
Remove it, yes. That's our desire.
Okay,
Going to be our recommendation.
okay. And then on the definition of rooming house, we had a suggestion to change the term rooming units to rooms. I think I want to add a comma behind dwelling, any dwelling or part of a dwelling or part of any dwelling, comma, containing one or more rooms, comma, in which space is let. Do we have any other suggestions on any further amendments to the definition?
No, I'm comfortable with that.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the comments and the clarification. The only other recommendation that I wanted to present today was on the following page, page 5 of 6, I believe. Page 4, actually. So when we were looking at permitted uses in all of our other zoning districts, as I was reviewing, I had noticed that there was one use that we do have several of these vehicle storage yards located in the city, and as I re-reviewed the ordinance, realized there really is not a specific use listed in our ordinance that covers those types of facilities. So it was a bit of a omission, really, from last month as far as looking at all of these uses, making sure they were all accounted for. I double-checked that. There's really no other use listed right now in the ordinance that covers that type of facility. So the suggestion is create the term, define the term, and indicate where it's going to be permitted. So I reviewed some other zoning guidance, did some research, looked at other ways of describing it and defining it, and so what I'm recommending is creation of a new use called vehicle storage yard. It's defined as a site where operable vehicles without occupants are stored for more than 24 hours, excluding auto sales, auto repair, and auto wrecking and/or recycling facilities. Storage is limited to motor vehicles, recreational vehicles, trailers, and boats and/or personal watercraft on trailers only. The outdoor storage area shall not be used to repair, maintain, improve, or rehabilitate any vehicle, trailer, or boat. So the intent of that definition is to distinguish it from a scrap yard or an auto wrecking yard, distinguish it from an auto sales lot, distinguish it from an auto repair area where people are storing vehicles that are not operable and or being worked on. This is for operable vehicles. This is, in Erie, Pennsylvania, we live on Lake Erie. There are a lot of boat storage yards where people do winter storage for their boats on trailers. We have thousands of slips in the city. We need a place to house these vehicles, to store these vehicles. Not only boats, but RVs, campers, other vehicles. But so the distinguishment, these are operable vehicles. We limit the types of vehicles that can be stored here. So this is not for construction equipment, construction vehicles. We do have a separate use that's listed in the manufacturing districts that's called contractor's yard, and that certainly covers things like construction equipment and materials that a contractor would use. Those are present also, but this is different from that. So I think it's important that we distinguish it differently. We have provisions in our ordinance that do kind of restrict the number of trailers, boats, campers, things like that in residential districts. Our residential districts limit storage of those types of things on residential lots to one. So if somebody has a boat and a camper, they're really only allowed to store one of them on their residential property behind the house. They need a place to store another vehicle if they happen to own more than one. This will accommodate that. The use is out there. We just had not formally put it in the ordinance.
How do we deal with marinas? There's something already in the definition that deals with boat storage during the off-season or storage in the off-season, and the kind of casual or other maintenance that happens in the normal operation of that kind of facility.
It would be great if we could get them to, or encourage through some zoning, some vertical storage rather than just laying them out everywhere for a massive yard, but
Yeah.
that's just me.
I think the economics of that is
It's not as bad as
storage.
it's
Suspect,
not,
yeah.
not as bad as
And
it
it-
seems.
Yeah, rack storage is a great,
It's much more
opportunity.
economical, it's much better land use too.
I'm sure the Port Authority is, since they largely control a lot of the property down on the waterfront, I think they've entertained the idea of leasing land for an operator of a rack storage facility, but I just don't think anything has come to fruition.
And I'm not sure, put my architect's hat on, I want to encourage a bunch of 80-foot tall structures with no opportunity to view through them on the waterfront,
Right, and that would be relegated to the waterfront manufacturing district. So essentially,
Yeah.
the South Pier is
Yeah.
where those facilities would be permitted because of the taller height
Yeah.
limitation, and things like that.
Yeah,
Yep.
But I'm thinking all the marinas on Port Authority property, the yacht club, all store a lot of boats, and maintenance occurs on them on a regular basis. Whether it's the normal spring cleaning to much, engine replacements to reconditioning.
Yeah, I mean,
hulls, that kind of stuff.
In my mind, spending an afternoon cleaning your boat, is obviously not in the same area as, hey, we're going to completely redo whatever, and it's going to take a few weekends.
Oh, yeah. Big
You know,
time
one
mechanical
afternoon,
repairs versus
Yeah,
just
one afternoon
re-
versus coming back, every night for a few hours and tinkering on it, those are different in my mind.
Everybody's grandfathered in right now,
Huh?
pre-existing any changes we make.
Yeah.
It's
I-
not-
I suppose that,
Makes it somewhat null and, well, I feel like maybe that's something for us to explore down the line. 'Cause I suspect we'd get plenty of pushback from the Port Authority regardless of what we do.
The section 306 of the zoning ordinance covers the waterfront districts. I'm not seeing anything that technically in that section that kind of prohibits that kind of activity at the marinas. Obviously there's winter storage, and then there's, a couple of storage yards, if you will, that are present, year-round. The marinas, when they're doing the boat storage in the parking lots, essentially that's temporary storage. It's typically for, half the year, roughly. So the temporary storage issue, right, the maintenance activity that happens even during the temporary storage is kind of, could be run the full gamut. But it's kind of couple of the permanent yards that are located in a couple of areas. The one in particular is on the South Pier, which is in a waterfront manufacturing district, would be, covered as far as your operating vehicles being stored there. That's one of the areas I was thinking of with this vehicle storage yard. But that's not really taken into effect like Liberty Pier, where, there's a lot of boats that, I think most of them are, I don't know about operable, but they're not taken apart, they're not in pieces necessarily, but there is a lot of stuff there. And, it's not, it's kind of its own animal, I guess.
Yeah.
It's not, I guess different marinas or different folks do store stuff there, but it's not necessarily, at least as far as I'm aware, necessarily related to one specific marina. You know, where some of the things you're describing are, you know, if it's related to one marina, you almost look at some of that activity as kind of accessory to the overall use of the property as a marina. You know, it's kind of temporary stuff. But that is
Yeah.
more of a permanent yard where there's,
I'm
Yeah.
okay with this language. I think
Huh?
this
Yeah,
language
I-
is sufficient for everywhere else in town, and we're dwelling on something right now has no effect
Yeah.
on it. So let's, in the interest of time, let's keep going.
Yeah. Extend my time parking time.
that's worth noting though.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm going to look more through section 306 just to look at, you know, there's a lot of design standards in 306 about
Right.
those properties. Sometimes, it may just be a matter of screening in some cases that should be compliant.
I understand.
Because we do have screening requirements, particularly in the waterfront districts.
I think you could also just, in the definition, add marinas to the list of facilities that are excluded. You know, excluding auto sales, auto repair, auto wrecking, and/or recycling facilities. If you were to insert marina in that list, that I think we can debate that another day.
Okay. Okay, so that's what I have for the name of the use, the definition of the use, and then it's being proposed to be permitted in the M1, M2, and WM zoning, just so all three of our industrial districts, excluding industrial park. It's not really, industrial park has its own set of requirements that, you know, frankly wouldn't lend itself to storage yard. So, but the other three industrial district, I think that's the most suitable place for these types of facilities. And I think that there's plenty of land out there to accommodate the demand for the use. So that's what I have for you today to add on to what was recommended last month, and what I'm hoping is that we can get these recommendations all addressed at the August 7th public hearing that council has scheduled to go over all of the recommended amendments to the ordinance. And that, you know, we'll see what the public has to say and see if, what council's will is to adopt the recommendations.
Do we need a motion to,
I would say yes, a motion to add these additional recommendations.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
all in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, thank you. Jackie wasn't sure whether she was going to be able to make it today or not, so I do not have anything to report on her behalf.
Okay. Move on to item 5, public comment. Anybody from the public going to make a comment? One of you two jokers want to make a comment?
Tough crowd, tough crowd.
All right, we'll move on.
Nobody has zoomed.
Nobody zoomed in?
I just wanted to double check that.
Okay, thank you. How about a motion for adjournment?
I'll move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Thank you.